Over the years of racing, I learned a bunch of useful tips and tricks from fellow friends who are in the sport. But what is it about those professional athletes? What do they do in their daily training routines and race preparations that sets them aside? Well, today I'm going to share with you some of the stories that I learned from inside the world of professional triathlon, and I guarantee you're going to find them interesting. Now then, travel. This is something that plays a really large part in any professional triathlete's life and scheduling. But whether it be for a key race or a training camp or even a holiday, being able to travel sensibly and having some key systems really matters. So by being diligent and organized, you can save yourself a lot of hassle. So first up, talking about luggage. One thing that took me a long time to be able to do and learn was that you needed to get the weight off of yourself. So not having a heavy backpack weighed down with all of the things you need, including the kitchen sink. And the real key to this actually is to not carry anything at all and start using a small wheelie case. That took me ages to start committing to, but believe me, it does make traveling that much easier through the airport and the terminals. Now then, once you talk about the bike itself, it can be expensive, and particularly in the US, where airline baggage fees can depressingly start adding up to more than the cost of the flight itself. So a good friend of mine, Richie Cunningham from Australia, he developed what I would have called a fairly ingenious solution to this costly problem, because he realized that he could circumnavigate the airline's fees by using an ice hockey bag or a hold-all that you would see kids and teams going through the airports with, because then it wasn't a bike. And he effectively, through a lot of mechanical know-how to be fair, broke the bike down, packed it up into a much smaller case than the bike bag or bike cases that I certainly used to travel with. He did need to take the forks out, take the cranks off, make everything a little bit smaller, and it was quite an amazing skill to see in action. But believe me, I traveled with him many times and he spent far less money than I ever did getting to and from races. And it even got better at the other end with the taxi shuttle or an Uber, for example, because you then didn't even need such a big vehicle, which could often be a lot more expensive too. So all in all, there was a lot of cost to be saved. So now then, much like the luggage that I just talked about, for traveling on the plane, there was lots of good habits I used to learn that I could implement. Firstly was wearing long flight socks or compression socks. Not to be confused with calf guards, mind you, because these are not the same thing. And in fact, a funny story, or not particularly for him involved, an athlete I knew, he thought he was doing himself a favour by doing that for a long haul overnight flight. But he actually arrived at the other end with extremely swollen and sore ankles and feet that the team physio had to battle with for quite some time to treat. So don't do that, but do please bring a water bottle. You can have it refilled on the plane quite happily, sip regularly and often on the flight, and it just keeps hydration, really well looked after. Another thing to work on is good nutrition, so is snacks. Healthy things like mixed fruits, dried nuts, some cereal bars, pack them into your wheelie bag or the onboard carry-on that you're taking. Most of these good tips, in fact, were drummed into me by my good friend Tim Don. But another couple that he taught me as well as those were to bring hand sanitizer, because you don't know who is also on that flight. So definitely bring that, use that little and often on the travels. And also take a little tube or packet of electrolyte tabs that you can dump into that water bottle you're bringing, which just keeps your salt levels nicely topped up. And finally, what actually happens if your luggage gets lost, which I know is something we don't want to think about, but I have been there. And the last thing you want to scupper all your finely tuned race prep for your goal race is the stress associated with having nothing when you arrive. So what I would always try to do is just pack your essentials into your carry-on. So definitely your race kit, things like your goggles, your run trainers, a full change of clothes the next day so at least you can get through that. Even something like your bike shoes and pedals if you can create the space, because then if things really start to get desperate and the airline still hasn't delivered your luggage by the time race day comes along, you can start thinking about even doing something like renting a bike. So with all that talk about race kit in mind, there's a few things on race day that I definitely would suggest you don't do, and that's try things that you haven't worn before. So race kits themselves. Don't try and experiment with a new one for race day because it looks nice and you think it might be better. You could get all sorts of uncomfortable chafing problems in potentially strange places that just definitely isn't worth it. Same goes for wetsuits. You don't want to try something like that that could start rubbing and chafing, especially in salt water. You can get really nasty rubs on your neck. And definitely don't try some new running trainers either, because I have seen many a lost toenail because of that, and shoes that have turned, shall I say, a nasty colour of red. And on the note of race day and tips and things that help matters go smoothly, there's lots of athletes who I've trained with and raced with over the years who've had different coaches, and I've picked up things from them that I've found quite interesting. And two of note come from the Australian coach Brett Sutton, who very well known for coaching athletes likes of Daniela Riff and Chrissy Wellington to multiple Ironman World Championship titles. And although his coaching methods are at times deemed a little bit, shall we say, untoward, there are some great tips that I have heard from Brett that he gives his athletes. Firstly, if they're competing in a major race and there's time early in the morning, which definitely isn't the case for things like Ironman or 70.3, but things like World Championships and even Olympic Games, I've heard that Brett will give his athletes a workout or something in the morning, even like bike hill reps, not for any physical gains, but simply to clear their mind and take their mind off of what is coming up. Really good coping strategy, I think. And secondly, he would definitely, from a practical point of view, not let athletes swim in a race venue prior to race day, because you just don't know what that water quality is going to be like. You're going to have to swim in it on race day, but don't take the risk beforehand, especially if it's a river. That's in fact the only time I've ever gotten ill in a race environment is from a river swim, because if you think about it, there's been bad weather the day before, all that water has to run off from somewhere and it could potentially end up in your race venue. So talking about racing and being able to set ourselves up for that successful race is something that got me thinking about chats I would have with my fellow Scot and good buddy David McNamee. Now, David is definitely an advocate of making sure that if you get ill, which unfortunately happens to all of us, but we do think we're superhuman, is to just back off the accelerator and just take some time to recover and get better. It's much better to take a day, 2, 3 off of your training rather than just muddle through average weeks of training for the sake of doing it. And in terms of the training, when you're doing it well, that's another thing that David really hammered home, was that the hard sessions should be really hard so you get the most out of those quality sessions. But then similarly, the easy recovery sessions have to be easy too, so that you could absorb all of the work that you're getting from those hard sessions. And then that rolls us back into racing. And a really good point that David made was last year at Kona 2018, when he really felt significantly average for most of the bike ride. And it wasn't until he was getting into the back half of the marathon that he really realised he was starting to come good and running himself into the podium. And the point here being that marathon running, and definitely Ironmans, are really, really long days, and you just don't know what's going to happen. So you have to stay positive and back yourself with all that good training. So talking about racing and the intricacies of that, one thing that athletes really pay attention to is their race day nutrition. And one thing that athletes often like to do, and they might not necessarily shout about it from the rooftops, is really get used to the on-brand nutrition that will be available at an event, like say an Ironman. Now, whether an athlete's got their own sponsor or not, there's a likelihood that they will have decided to make sure they're used to what they're going to pick up at the aid stations during an event like an Ironman, and have that inside their own branded water bottles regardless, because you don't really know what's in a water bottle anyway. And the reason that they're going to do this is because you can actually usually know the exact flavour that an Ironman is going to be giving out at their aid stations in advance, reading the race materials. And by getting used to that and going out and getting that and training on it and getting used to it, your stomach's not going to get nearly as much of a shock when you're racing on it. So it just makes good sense. So talking about race nutrition and specifics, this reminded me of a conversation I had with Heather fairly recently about when she did Kona 2 years ago, and a conversation she had with none other than Sydney Olympic silver medalist and 2006 Kona champion Michaela Jones. Now, Michaela very sensibly suggested to Heather that she freeze her water bottles the night before race day, so that once she got out of the swim and onto the bike, she's going to have really nice cold liquid to sip from. Now, don't worry, they will defrost, I promise you, as long as it is a really hot race venue like somewhere like Hawaii. But another good tip as well that Michaeli gave to Heather was think about what you put in your special need bags. And what she was saying was things like sweets or gummy bears or basically something tasty that you're going to look forward to that isn't race nutrition. Because I guarantee by the time you get deep into the run course, when you've got access to special needs bags, you're not really going to be fancying the race nutrition, and your special needs bags can give you the chance to get much needed calories. So now for something that is a little bit more serious, and that's the subject of road safety. And it impacts an awful lot of us because, well, we go out on the roads and train all the time. And something that I am really passionate about is just don't aggravate drivers. It really isn't worth it. And I guess I'll finish with a couple of examples of two friends who I trained with a lot over the years. First up was Andreas Rehler, who many years ago was training with the German team in South Africa, and they were passed far too closely by a truck, and they gave a bit of abuse and shouted at the driver, only for a few minutes later, further down the road, to be confronted by the driver standing in the road pointing a shotgun at them, which obviously was a little bit worrying. And secondly, my good friend Richie Cunningham, who I spoke about a little while ago with his ingenious hockey bag. He was training at home in Australia and again was passed far too close by a truck and gave some abuse that he probably shouldn't have done, only for him to be attacked by said driver with an axe handle as that driver ran down his driveway, which he had now parked up in, unbeknown to Richie. And needless to say, Richie didn't fare too well in that battle. So the moral of this story is you just don't know who is behind the wheel of a car, and it really isn't worth giving them any sort of abuse because, well, you just don't know what they're capable of. Now, it's clear that professional athletes are able to distill down to the most important of lessons. And that's simply a case of trial and error because, after all, they are living the life of triathlon on a day-to-day basis. But most of these stories, if not all, are entirely transferable and not solely linked to professional athletes. So maybe you're already employing some of these tactics or you've got some of your own stories. Please share them with me in the comment section below. We'd love to read them. If you've enjoyed this video, please hit that thumb up like button, click on the globe to subscribe and get all our other content. And if you want to see a video about pros to watch in 2019, you can get that here. And if you want to see one of our asks about what do pros do on race morning, that's here.